Mommy hasn't eaten. Can you share expired bread? The words landed softly, yet they struck harder than any boardroom confrontation ever had. The boy's voice was thin, almost apologetic, as if hunger itself was something to be ashamed of. Ethan Hale froze just inside the glass doors of his headquarters, one hand still wrapped around his phone, the other resting on the handle of a briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The building hummed with polished efficiency, marble floors, quiet footsteps, the scent of expensive coffee drifting from the executive lounge. This was his kingdom. A place where numbers ruled, emotions were trimmed away, and every decision was measured in profit margins. And yet, right there near the security desk, stood a boy who didn't belong to any spreadsheet. He couldn't have been more than 7. Too thin for his age, jacket sleeves hanging past his wrists, shoes worn down at the toes. In his hands was a small plastic bag, the kind bakeries use for leftover loaves. He held it like it contained something precious, something fragile. I can pay, the boy added quickly, patting his pocket, though the gesture was more hopeful than convincing. I have coins. Oh, I can come back tomorrow. The guard behind the desk looked uncomfortable, already preparing the polite refusal he'd likely given 100 times before. Company policy. No loitering. No soliciting. Ethan knew the script well. He had approved it himself. But before the guard could speak, Ethan's eyes caught something else. The way the boy kept glancing toward the street, as if worried someone might disappear if he looked away for too long. Where's your mother? Ethan asked, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. The boy brightened, relieved to be addressed. She's outside. She's very tired today. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. She didn't eat yesterday either. The lobby suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. Ethan crouched down, bringing himself eye level with the child. Years of commanding rooms full of adults had taught him how to project authority, but this was different. This required something he hadn't practiced in a long time. What's your name? He asked. Leo, the boy said. My mom says it means brave. Ethan swallowed. She's right. From the corner of his eye, he noticed employees slowing their steps, curiosity tugging them out of their routines. Whispers hovered but didn't quite form. The CEO kneeling in a tailored suit was not a sight anyone expected before morning meetings. Is the bread for you? Ethan asked gently. Leo shook his head immediately. No. I can wait. Mommy needs it first. Something cracked, quietly, invisibly, inside Ethan's chest. He stood and turned to the guard. Where did he get the bread? Bakery down the street, the guard replied. They throw out the leftovers at noon. Kid usually comes by around then. Usually. Ethan looked back at Leo. How long have you and your mom been managing like this? Leo shrugged, the universal gesture of children who have learned too early that some questions don't have answers. Since Daddy went away. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. Ethan straightened, smoothing his jacket as if preparing for a negotiation. Stay here, he told Leo. Just a moment. He walked toward the cafe inside the building, ignoring the startled looks from his assistants. He ordered fresh sandwiches, hot soup, fruit, bottled water, far more than anyone could reasonably eat in one sitting. He paid without checking the total. When he returned, Leo's eyes widened. That's too much. No, Ethan said softly. It's enough. He handed the bag to the boy, who took it carefully, as though afraid it might vanish if he moved too fast. Can my mom come in? Leo asked. She doesn't like to ask. Ethan nodded. Of course. They stepped outside together. The city noise rushed back in, horns, footsteps, life moving on at its usual indifferent pace. Near the building's edge sat a woman on the curb, shoulders slumped, hair pulled back in a tired knot. She looked up sharply when she saw Leo, worry flooding her face until she noticed Ethan standing beside him. I'm sorry, she said immediately, struggling to her feet. He shouldn't have bothered you. We were just leaving. You didn't bother me, Ethan replied. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Please, come inside. Just for a moment. She hesitated, pride warring with exhaustion, then glanced at the bag in Leo's hands. Her resolve softened. Inside, as she took the first careful sip of soup, her hands trembled. She tried to hide it, but Ethan noticed. He noticed everything. The way she ate slowly so Leo wouldn't think she was too hungry, the way Leo watched her between bites, counting them like a silent promise. "What do you do, sir?" she asked quietly, eyes flicking to his suit, the building, the people who seemed to defer to him without question. Ethan opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. Titles suddenly felt inadequate. "I run this company," he said simply. Her eyes widened, embarrassment flushing her cheeks. "I didn't know. It doesn't matter," he interrupted gently. "What matters is that you're here." From the glass walls of the conference room above, the board of directors had begun to gather, unaware that the morning's agenda was about to change. Ethan glanced at his watch, then back at Leo, who was smiling now, really smiling, for the first time. And as Ethan stood there, surrounded by the quiet hum of power and privilege, he felt an unfamiliar certainty settle in his chest, the sense that this moment, this interruption, was not an inconvenience at all, but the beginning of something that would demand far more from him than any deal ever had. Ethan excused himself briefly, stepping away to silence the buzzing phone in his pocket. The screen lit up with names and reminders, meetings stacked like dominoes, waiting to be tipped. He turned it face down without answering. Through the glass, he could still see Leo swinging his legs on the chair, soup spoon clutched like a trophy, and his mother. Her name, she had said, was Mara, holding the warm cup as though it were grounding her to the room. When Ethan returned, Mara stood awkwardly, unsure whether to thank him again or apologize once more. "We don't need charity," she said quietly, as if rehearsed. "I'm just between jobs. Things will improve." "I believe you," Ethan replied. "But believing doesn't fill an empty stomach." He pulled out a chair and sat across from them, ignoring the curious glances from passing staff. "What line of work were you in?" "I was a nurse," Mara said, eyes dropping to her hands. "Night shifts mostly. Then the hospital downsized. Temporary contract, they said." Temporary turned into nothing. Ethan nodded slowly. He knew that story, had funded startups built on the promise of fixing broken systems, yet here was proof that the cracks still swallowed people whole. "And Leo?" She smiled faintly. "He's good at math. Faster than me. He pretends not to notice when I skip meals." Leo looked up, caught. "You said you weren't hungry." "I wasn't," she lied gently. Ethan leaned back, exhaling. The board meeting upstairs was now 10 minutes overdue. His assistant hovered at the edge of the room, clearly torn between protocol and the unusual gravity of the scene. Ethan caught her eye and gave a small shake of his head. "Not now." "Do you have somewhere safe to stay?" he asked. Mara hesitated. "For the week. A friend. After that, we'll see." Leo's grip tightened around his spoon. Ethan stood. "Come with me," he said, the words arriving before he'd fully shaped the plan behind them. They followed him into a private elevator usually reserved for executives. The doors slid shut with a soft chime, sealing them in a quiet bubble as the car ascended. Leo pressed his nose to the mirrored wall, watching the numbers climb. "This is very high," he murmured. "It is," Ethan agreed. "Sometimes too high to see what's right in front of us." The elevator opened into a conference room bathed in light. The city sprawled beyond the windows, alive and indifferent. The board members fell silent as Ethan entered with his unexpected guests. "This meeting is postponed," Ethan announced calmly. "I'll explain later." There were murmurs, raised eyebrows, a protest half-formed, but something in his expression stopped it cold. Authority, honed over decades, did its work. He guided Mara and Leo into an adjoining office, smaller, quieter. He poured water, set down the remaining food, and closed the door. "I'm not offering pity," Ethan said, meeting Mara's gaze. "I'm offering options. Temporary housing. A stipend while you get back on your feet. And if you're willing, an interview with our healthcare division. We partner with several clinics." Mara stared at him, disbelief flickering into cautious hope. "Why?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked at Leo instead, who was lining up sugar packets with careful precision. "Because once," he said finally, "someone did something similar for me. And because this building has enough room for more than just profits." Tears welled in Mara's eyes. She wiped them quickly, embarrassed. "I don't know how to thank you." "By letting me help," Ethan replied. "And by not disappearing tomorrow." She nodded, a promise forming in the space between them. Later, after arrangements were made and his assistant escorted Mara and Leo downstairs with keys to a company-owned apartment used for visiting partners, Ethan returned to the conference room. The board members were restless, impatience simmering. That interruption, one of them began, was highly unorthodox. So is ignoring reality, Ethan said evenly. He stood at the head of the table, hands resting on the polished wood. We talk about corporate responsibility like it's a branding exercise. Today, it wasn't. Silence followed. Some faces softened, others hardened. When the meeting finally adjourned, Ethan remained alone, the city lights beginning to glow as afternoon slid toward evening. His phone buzzed again. This time, a message. Mara, Leo wanted me to tell you his full. He says thank you for seeing us. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, a tightness in his throat he hadn't felt since becoming a father himself. Before the accident, before the silence that had followed. He replied simply, tell him he reminded me of something important. Outside, the city continued its relentless rhythm. Inside, Ethan sat back in his chair, aware that the balance he'd carefully maintained for years had shifted. Not broken, shifted. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, he knew that whatever came next would ask more of him than any quarterly report ever could. That night, Ethan didn't go home right away. He sat in his car in the underground garage long after the engine had gone quiet, staring at his reflection in the windshield. The ghost of the man he used to be stared back, sharp, efficient, untouchable. Yet beneath it all, something else stirred, something restless. Leo's small voice echoed again in his mind, not as sound but as feeling, persistent and impossible to ignore. When he finally drove, he didn't head toward his penthouse. Instead, he found himself circling the city, passing streets he normally only saw from tinted windows. Neon signs flickered, vendors packed up their carts, people folded their lives into small routines of survival. He wondered how many Leos walked these sidewalks every day, brave in ways no boardroom ever demanded. The next morning, Ethan arrived early. Before assistants, before meetings, before the machinery of power came alive. He called the head of human resources and asked for a full review of the company's social outreach programs. Not summaries. Not slides. Names. Stories. Outcomes. By mid-morning, an email circulated quietly through upper management. A new initiative was being drafted, effective immediately. Emergency support for families in crisis. Paid internships for displaced professionals. Partnerships with shelters, clinics, schools. It wasn't branded yet. There was no press release. Ethan didn't want applause. Not this time. On the 10th floor, Mara sat stiffly in a borrowed blazer, Leo beside her in a small chair, swinging his legs again. He'd insisted on coming, afraid that if he stayed behind, something might vanish. Mara had braided his hair neatly, trying to give him a sense of occasion. The interview room felt different from the lobby, less marble, more purpose. When the panel entered, Mara recognized one of the executives from the news. Her hands trembled, but she straightened her back. She wasn't asking for mercy, she was offering skill. Ethan watched through the glass, silent. He saw the way Mara's voice steadied as she spoke about triage, about night shifts, about holding strangers' hands when no one else would. He saw Leo tracing shapes on the table with his finger, listening even when he didn't understand the words. When the panel nodded, when one of them smiled, Ethan felt a quiet relief he hadn't expected. At lunch, he joined them in the cafeteria, an unheard-of move that sent ripples through the company. Leo proudly showed him how he could read the dessert menu by himself now. Mara tried not to look overwhelmed by the abundance. This place is big, Leo said between bites. Does everyone work for you? Ethan smiled. No. I work with them. Leo considered this seriously, then nodded as if it made perfect sense. In the days that followed, Ethan noticed changes, not just in the company, but in himself. He listened more. He interrupted less. He began asking questions that had nothing to do with margins. Some executives resisted, others leaned in. A few resigned. He let them go without regret. One evening, as rain streaked the windows, Ethan received another message from Mara. They offered me the position. I start Monday. He replied immediately. You earned it. The apartment they'd given her was modest but warm. When Ethan visited, unannounced, to avoid ceremony, Leo ran to the door holding a drawing. It was of a tall building with a small stick figure standing beside a bigger one. Above them, a sun that looked suspiciously like it was smiling. That's us, Leo said. You're not as tall in real life, but that's okay. Ethan laughed, the sound surprising even himself. They sat on the floor, pizza boxes open, the kind of dinner that required no etiquette. Mara talked about her first day, about learning systems, about the relief of having a schedule again. Ethan listened, truly listened, as if these details mattered more than any market forecast. Later, as Leo dozed off against the couch, Ethan stood by the window. The city hummed below, distant and familiar. Mara joined him, careful not to wake her son. "I don't know how to repay you," she said softly. Ethan shook his head. "Don't turn this into a debt. Let it be a bridge." She nodded, understanding settling between them. As Ethan prepared to leave, Leo stirred. "Will you come back?" he asked sleepily. "Yes," Ethan said without hesitation. "I will." Driving away, he felt something settle, not comfort, not certainty, but commitment. The kind that didn't announce itself with grand speeches or neat endings. The kind that unfolded slowly, demanded consistency, and refused to be forgotten. Behind him, in a small apartment filled with quiet breathing and the promise of tomorrow, a boy slept without hunger gnawing at his dreams. Ahead of him, a company, and a life, were beginning to reshape themselves around a truth Ethan could no longer unsee. The following weeks blurred into a rhythm Ethan hadn't known he was missing. Mornings still began with reports and decisions, but now there were pauses, small, intentional spaces where he allowed the world beyond numbers to exist. He found himself asking his assistant how her mother was doing after surgery, remembering the name of the janitor who worked late shifts, noticing which employees stayed quiet in meetings not because they lacked ideas, but because no one had ever invited them to speak. One afternoon, Leo appeared in the lobby again, this time wearing a slightly oversized backpack and a grin that barely fit his face. Mara followed, embarrassed. "I told him you'd be busy," she said. "He insisted on showing you." Leo unzipped the backpack and pulled out a school workbook. "I got stars," he announced proudly. 3 of them. "My teacher says I'm very good at problem solving." Ethan crouched down, the motion now familiar. "That's impressive," he said. "Problem solvers change the world." Leo beamed, then lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Mom says you help people solve problems too." Ethan glanced up at Mara. She looked healthier, still tired, but steadier, as if the ground beneath her feet had finally stopped shifting. "Your mom helps people in ways I can't," he replied. "We're a team." That night, Ethan attended a charity gala he would normally have skipped through with polite smiles and hollow pledges. This time, when donors asked about his company's new initiatives, he didn't recite rehearsed lines. He told them about a nurse who'd lost her job and a boy who thought bravery meant asking for expired bread so his mother wouldn't starve. The room grew quieter with every sentence. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in. The next morning, funding doubled. Change, Ethan realized, didn't always come from force. Sometimes it came from telling the truth out loud and letting it echo where it needed to. At home, his penthouse felt different now. Too quiet. Too empty. He caught himself staring at the unused second bedroom, the one he'd never had the courage to clear after the accident. One evening, he opened the door fully for the first time in years. Dust hung in the air like a held breath. He didn't step inside, but he didn't close the door either. Mara's workdays grew longer, but her smile came easier. She no longer flinched when Leo asked for seconds. She began planning, small plans at first, then bigger ones. Saving. Studying. Rebuilding. One Saturday, Ethan took them to a science museum. It wasn't a calculated gesture. Leo had mentioned planets in passing, and the idea stuck. Watching Leo dart from exhibit to exhibit, tugging Ethan's sleeve with questions that had no simple answers, something inside Ethan loosened. He didn't rush. He didn't check his phone. He stood beneath a model of the solar system and listened. "Do you think people can get lost in space?" Leo asked. "Yes," Ethan said. "But they can find their way back too." Mara watched them from a bench, a strange mix of gratitude and something deeper settling in her chest. She hadn't planned on this connection. It frightened her, how easily Leo had trusted him, how naturally Ethan fit into the quiet spaces of their lives. That night, after Leo fell asleep, Mara finally voiced the question she'd been holding back. "What happens when this ends?" she asked softly. "When things go back to normal?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked at Leo's door, then back at her. "I don't think I want things to go back," he said. "I think normal was the problem." Weeks later, a minor crisis hit the company. A deal fell through. Stocks dipped. Old voices resurfaced, whispering about distractions, about priorities. Ethan stood firm. He addressed the board with calm clarity, owning the loss without retreating from the path he'd chosen. Some investors left. Others stayed, curious, loyal to something that felt more durable than profit. Late one evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Ethan received a call from the hospital. A child from one of the partner clinics needed urgent funding for treatment not covered by insurance. Without hesitation, Ethan approved it. Then he sat back, the weight of a decision pressing on him, not as a burden, but as responsibility finally accepted. He drove to Mara's apartment afterward, unsure why, only knowing he needed to see the proof of what this responsibility meant. Leo answered the door in socks, half asleep. "You came," Leo said, as if it were obvious he would. Ethan nodded. "I did." They sat quietly on the couch, the city breathing outside, the television murmuring low. For the first time in a long while, Ethan didn't feel like a man reacting to loss or success. He felt present, anchored in a moment that didn't ask him to perform. As he left, Mara watched from the doorway. "You don't have to carry everyone," she said gently. Ethan paused, turning back. "I know," he replied. "But I don't want to walk past them anymore." Behind him, the hallway lights flickered softly, and ahead of him, the night stretched on, unfinished, demanding, and full of lives intersecting in ways no one could fully predict. Months later, the city woke to a different kind of headline. Not about mergers or market dominance, but about a company that had quietly rewritten its values and a CEO who had stepped down from the distance power usually demands. Ethan didn't read the article until much later. He was too busy standing in a school auditorium, surrounded by the uneven music of children practicing for a small performance that mattered more than any keynote speech ever had. Leo stood on the stage, scanning the crowd with anxious eyes until he spotted Ethan. Relief washed over his face, followed by a grin so bright it seemed to light the room. When the music began, Leo sang loudly, off-key, fearless, alive. Mara watched from beside Ethan, her hands clasped together, tears she no longer tried to hide sliding down her cheeks. "He used to be so quiet," she whispered. "I thought hunger had taken his voice." Ethan didn't respond. His chest felt too full. He remembered the boy with the plastic bag, the careful apology woven into every word. He remembered how close the world had come to losing this sound, this light, simply because it had been inconvenient to notice. After the performance, Leo ran straight into Ethan's arms without hesitation. No calculation. No doubt. Just trust. Ethan held him a second longer than necessary, grounding himself in the weight of something real. Life did not suddenly become perfect. There were still hard days. There were still nights when Ethan sat alone, grief from his past returning quietly, reminding him of what he had lost. But now, the grief no longer lived alone. It shared space with purpose. Mara rose quickly within the company, not because of favoritism, but because competence has a way of shining when given air. She worked long hours, still, but now she came home to certainty. To meals she didn't ration. To a future she could plan instead of fear. The programs Ethan had started grew beyond him. Other companies followed. Some out of conviction, others out of competition. Ethan didn't care why they joined, only that they did. He had learned that impact didn't need purity, it needed momentum. One evening, long after the city lights flickered on, Ethan found himself back in the lobby where it had all begun. The marble floors gleamed as they always had, but he saw them differently now. Near the security desk, a small plaque had been installed. No names. Just words. No one should have to beg to survive. A new security guard stood there, nodding politely. "Evening, sir." Ethan smiled. "Good evening." As he stepped outside, he noticed a woman hesitating near the entrance, a child holding her hand. The child clutched a folded piece of paper, eyes darting nervously. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Ethan didn't wait. He walked toward them, already lowering himself to the child's height. "Hi," he said gently. "What's your name?" The city continued to move around them, cars passing, people rushing, time refusing to slow. But for Ethan, for this child, for anyone willing to truly see, this moment mattered just as much as the first one ever had. Years later, Leo would barely remember the hunger. Memory softened sharp edges over time. But he would remember something else clearly, the feeling of being chosen when he thought he was invisible. He would grow up believing that help was not humiliation, that kindness was not weakness, and that bravery sometimes sounded like a small voice daring to ask. And Ethan, standing at the center of a life he never planned but would never trade, finally understood what no success had ever taught him before. The world does not change when powerful people give speeches. It changes when they stop walking past pain. It changes when a single moment of attention becomes a lifelong decision. When a closed door opens. When a child eats. When dignity is restored. And in a city that once watched a boy ask for expired bread, something far greater had risen. Not loudly, not suddenly, but undeniably. Hope.